Secondly, I believe that that it's far better for the United States, instead of concentrating our aid, particularly in the underdeveloped world, on surplus military equipment. We poured $300 million of surplus military equipment into Laos. We paid more military aid, more aid into Laos per in the world. And we all know now in the direction of the communists. I believe instead of doing that, we should concentrate our aid in long-term loans, which these people can pay back, either in hard money or in local currency. This permits them to maintain their self-respect. It permits us to make sure that the projects which are invested in are going to produce greater wealth. And I believe that in cases of India and Africa and Latin America, that this is where our emphasis should be. I would strengthen the Development Loan Fund. And Senator Fulbright, Senator Humphrey, and I tried to do that. We tried to provide an appropriation of $1.5 billion for 5 years on a long-term loan basis, which this administration opposed. And unless we're ready to carry out programs like that in the 60s, this battle for economic survival, which these people are waging, are going to be lost. And if India should lose her battle, with 35% of the people of the underdeveloped world within her borders, then I believe that the balance of power could move against us. I think the United States can afford to do these things. I think that we could not afford not to do these things. This goes to our survival. And here in a country which, if it is moving ahead, if it's developing its economy to the fullest, which we are not now, in my judgment, we'll have the resources to meet our military commitments and also our commitments overseas. I believe it's essential that we do it, because in the next 10 years, the balance of power is going to begin to move in the world from one direction or another, towards us or towards the communists. And unless we begin to identify ourselves not only with the anti-communist fight, but also with the fight against poverty and hunger, these people are going to begin to turn to the communists as an example. I believe we can do it. If we build our economy the way we should, we can afford to do these things, and we must do it.
Mr. Vice President.
Senator Kennedy has put a great deal of stress on the necessity for economic assistance. This is important, but it's also tremendously important to bear in mind that when you pour in money without pouring in technical assistance as well, that you have a disastrous situation. We need to step up exchange. We need to step up technical assistance so that trained people in these newly developing countries can operate the economies. We also have to have in mind something else with regard to this whole situation in the world. And that is that as America moves forward, we not only must think in terms of fighting communism, but we must also think primarily in terms of the interests of these countries. We must associate ourselves with their aspirations. We must let them know that the great American ideals of independence, of the right of people to be free, of the right to progress, that these are ideals that belong not to ourselves alone, but they belong to everybody. This we must get across to the world. And we can't do it unless we do have adequate funds for example, information, which has been cut by the Congress, adequate funds for technical assistance. The other point that I would make with regard to economic assistance and technical assistance is that the United States must not rest its case here alone. This is primarily an ideological battle, a battle for the minds and the hearts and the souls of men. We must not meet the communists purely in the field of gross atheistic materialism. We must stand for our ideals.
Mr. Levy with a question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, the Labor Department today added 5 more major industrial centers to the list of areas with substantial unemployment. You said in New York this week that as president you would use the full powers of the government, if necessary, to combat unemployment. Specifically, what measures would you advocate and at what point?
Employment, we first must concentrate on the very areas to which you refer, the so-called depressed areas. Now, in the last Congress, the special session of the Congress, there was a bill, one by the President, one by Senator Kennedy and members of his party. Now, the bill that the President had submitted would have provided more aid for those areas that really need it, areas like Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and the areas of West Virginia, than the ones that Senator Kennedy was supporting. On the other hand, we found that the bill got into the legislative difficulties, and consequently, no action was taken. So point one, at the highest priority, we must get a bill for depressed areas through the next Congress. I have made recommendations on that, and I have discussed them previously, and I will spell them out further in the campaign. Second, as we consider this problem of unemployment, we have to realize where it is. In analyzing the figures, we will find that our unemployment exists among the older citizens. It exists also among those who are inadequately trained. That is, those who do not have an adequate opportunity for education. It also exists among minority groups. If we're going to combat unemployment, then, we have to do a better job in these areas. That's why I have a program for education, a program in the case of equal job opportunities, and one that would also deal with our older citizens. Now, finally, with regard to the whole problem of combating recession, as you call it, we must use the full resources of the government in these respects. One, we must see to it that credit is expanded as we go into any recessionary period. And understand, I do not believe we're going into a recession. I believe this economy is sound and that we're going to move up. But second, in addition to that, if we do get into a recessionary period, we should move on that part of the economy which is represented by the private sector. And I mean stimulate that part of the economy that can create jobs, the private sector of the economy. This means through tax reform and, if necessary, tax cuts that will stimulate more jobs. I favor that rather than massive federal spending programs which will come into effect usually long after you pass through the recessionary period. So we must use all of these weapons for the purpose of combating recession if it should come, but I do not expect it to come.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, Mr. Nixon has stated the record inaccurately in regard to the depressed area bill. I'm very familiar with it. It came out of the committee of which I was the chairman, the Labor Subcommittee in '55. I was the floor manager. We've passed an area redevelopment bill far more effective than the bill the administration suggested on 2 occasions, and the president vetoed it both times. We passed a bill again this year in the Senate, and it died in the Rules Committee of the House of Representatives. Let me make it very clear that the bill that Mr. Nixon talked about did not mention Wilkesboro or Scranton. It did not mention West Virginia. Our bill was far more effective. The bill introduced and sponsored by Senator Douglas was far more effective in trying to stimulate the economy of those areas. Second, he has mentioned the problem of our older citizens. I cannot still understand why this administration and Mr. Nixon oppose putting medical care for the aged under Social Security to give them some security. Third, I believe we should step up the use of our surplus foods in these areas until we're able to get the people back at work. 5 cents a day is what the food package averages per person. Fourthly, I believe we should stimulate the economy. I believe we should not carry out a hard money, high interest rate policy, which helped intensify certainly the recession of 1958, and I think helped bring to the slowdown of 1960. If we move into a recession in 61, then I would agree that we have to put more money into the economy, and it can be done by either one of the 2 methods discussed. One is by programs such as aid to education. The other would be to make a judgment on what's the most effective tax program to stimulate our economy.
Mr. Niven with a question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator, while the main theme of your campaign has been this decline of American power and prestige in the last 8 years, you've hardly criticized President Eisenhower at all. And in a speech last weekend, you said you had no quarrel with the president. Now, isn't Mr. Eisenhower and not Mr. Nixon responsible for any such decline?
Well, I understood that this was the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, according to all the Republican propaganda that I've read. The question is what we're going to do in the future. I've been critical of this administration, and I've been critical of the president. In fact, Mr. Nixon discussed that a week ago in a speech. I believe that our power and prestige in the last 8 years has declined. Now, what is the issue is what we're going to do in the future. Now, that's an issue between Mr. Nixon and myself. He feels that we're moving ahead we're not going into a recession in this country economically. He feels that our power and prestige is stronger than it ever was relative to that of the communists, that we're moving ahead. I disagree. And I believe the American people have to make the choice on November 8th between the view of whether we have to move ahead faster, whether what we're doing now is not satisfactory, whether we have to build greater strength at home and abroad, and Mr. Nixon's view. That's the great issue. President Eisenhower moves from the scene on January 20th, and the next 4 years are the critical years. And that's the debate. That's the argument between Mr. Nixon and myself. And on that issue, the American people have to make their judgment. And I think it's an important judgment. I think in many ways this election is more important than any since 1932, or certainly almost any in this century, because we disagree very fundamentally on the position of the United States. And if his view prevails, then I think that's going to bring an important result to this country in the 60s. If our view prevails that we have to do more, that we have to make a greater national and international effort, that we have lost prestige in Latin America. The president of Brazil, the new incumbent, running for office, called on Castro during his campaign because he thought it was important to get the vote of those who were supporting Castro in Latin America. In Africa, the United States has ignored Africa. We gave more scholarships to the Congo this summer we offered them than we'd given to all of Africa the year before. Less than 200 for all the countries of Africa, and they need trained leadership more than anything. We've been having a very clear decision in the last 8 years. Mr. Nixon has been part of that administration. He's had experience in it. And I believe this administration has not met its responsibilities in the last 8 years, that our power relative to that of the communists is declining, that we're facing a very hazardous time in the 60s, and unless the United States begin to move here, unless we start to go ahead, I don't believe that we're going to meet our responsibility to our own people or to the cause of freedom. I think the choice is clear, and it involves the future.
Mr. Vice President.
First of all, I think Senator Kennedy should make up his mind with regard to my responsibility. In our first debate, he indicated that I had not had experience, or at least had not participated significantly in the making of the decisions. I'm glad to hear tonight that he does suggest that I have had some experience. Let me make my position clear. I have participated in the discussions leading to decisions in this administration. I am proud of the record of this administration. I don't stand on it because it isn't something to stand on, but something to build on. Now, looking at Senator Kennedy's credentials, he is suggesting that he will move America faster and further than I will. But what does he offer? He offers retreads of programs that failed. I submit to you that as you look at his program, for example, with regard to the Federal Reserve and free money or loose money, low interest rates, his program in the economic field generally are the programs that were adopted and tried during the Truman administration. And when we compare the economic progress of this country in the Truman administration with that of the Eisenhower administration, we find that in every index, there has been a great deal more performance and more progress in this administration than in that one. I say the programs and the leadership that failed then is not the program and the leadership that America needs now. I say that the American people don't want to go back to those policies. And incidentally, if Senator Kennedy disagrees, he should indicate where he believes those policies are different from those he's advocating today.
Mr. Spivak with a question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, according to news dispatches, Soviet Premier Khrushchev said today that Prime Minister Macmillan had assured him that there would be a summit conference next year after the presidential elections. Have you given any cause for such assurance, and do you consider it desirable or even possible that there would be a summit conference next year if Mr. Khrushchev persists in the conditions he's laid down?
No, of course, I haven't talked to Prime Minister Macmillan. It would not be appropriate for me to do so. The president is still going to be president for the next 4 months. And he, of course, is the only one who could commit this country in this period. As far as a summit conference is concerned, I want to make my position absolutely clear. I would be willing as president to meet with Mr. Khrushchev or any other world leader if it would serve the cause of peace. I would be willing to meet with him, however, unless there were preparations for that conference which would give us some reasonable certainty that you were going to have some success. We must not build up the hopes of the world and then dash them, as was the case in Paris. There, Mr. Khrushchev came to that conference determined to break it up. He was going to break it up because he knew that he wasn't going to get his way on Berlin and on the other key matters with which he was concerned at the Paris conference. Now, if we're going to have another summit conference, there must be negotiations at the diplomatic level, the ambassadors, the secretaries of state, and others at that level, prior to that time, which will delineate the issues and which will prepare the way for the heads of state to meet and make some progress. Otherwise, if we find the heads of state meeting and not making progress, we will find that the cause of peace will have been hurt rather than helped. So under these circumstances, I therefore strongly urge, and I will strongly hold, if I have the opportunity to urge or to hold this position, that any summit conference would be gone into only after the most careful preparation and only after Mr. Khrushchev, after his disgraceful conduct at Paris, after his disgraceful conduct at the United Nations, gave some assurance that he really wanted to sit down and talk and to accomplish something and not just to make propaganda.
Senator Kennedy.
I have no disagreement with the Vice President's position on that. My view is the same as his. Let me say there is only one point I would add. Before we go into the summit, before we ever meet again, I think it's important that the United States build its strength, that it build its military strength as well as its own economic strength. If we negotiate from a position where the power balance or wave is moving away from us, it's extremely difficult to reach a successful decision on Berlin as well as the other questions. Now, the next President of the United States in his first year is going to be confronted with a very serious question on our defense of Berlin, our commitment to Berlin. It's going to be a test of our nerve and will. It's going to be a test of our strength. And because we're going to move in 61 and 2, partly because we have not maintained our strength with sufficient vigor in the last years, I believe that before we meet that crisis, that the next President of the United States should send a message to Congress asking for a revitalization of our military strength. Because come spring or late in the winter, we're going to be face to face with the most serious Berlin crisis since 1949 or 50. On the question of the summit, I agree with the position of Mr. Nixon. I would not meet Mr. Khrushchev unless there were some agreements at the secondary level, foreign ministers or ambassadors, which would indicate that the meeting would have some hope of success or a useful exchange of ideas.
Mr. Levy with a question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator, in your acceptance speech at Los Angeles, you said that your campaign would be based not on what you intend to offer the American people, but what you intend to ask of them. Since that time, you have spelled out many of the things that you intend to do, but you have made only vague reference to sacrifice and self-denial. A year or so ago, I believe, you said that you would not hesitate to recommend a tax increase if you considered it necessary. Is this what you have in mind?
Well, I don't think that in the winter of 61, under present economic conditions, a tax increase would be desirable. In fact, it would be deflationary, it would cause great unemployment, it would cause a real slowdown in our economy. If it ever becomes necessary and is wise economically and essential to our security, I would have no hesitancy in suggesting a tax increase or any other policy which would defend the United States. I have talked in every speech about the fact that these are going to be very difficult times in the 1960s and that we're going to have to meet our responsibility as citizens. I'm talking about a national mood. I'm talking about our willingness to bear any burdens in order to maintain our own freedom and in order to meet our freedom around the globe. We don't know what the future is going to bring, but I would not want anyone to elect me President of the United States or vote for me under the expectation that life would be easier if I were elected. Now, many of the programs that I'm talking about, economic growth, care for the aged, development of our natural resources, build the strength of the United States. That's how the United States began to prepare for its great actions in World War II and in the post-war period. If we're moving ahead, if we're providing a viable economy, if our people have sufficient resources so that they can consume what we produce, then this country's on the move. Then we're stronger. Then we set a better example to the world. So we have the problem not only of building our own military strength and extending our policies abroad, we have to do a job here at home. So I believe that the policies that I recommend come under the general heading of strengthening the United States. We're using our steel capacity 55% today. We're not able to consume what we're able to produce at a time when the Soviet Union is making great economic gains. And all I say is, I don't know what the 60s will bring, except I think they will bring hard times in the international sphere. I hope we can move ahead here at home in the United States. I'm confident we can do a far better job of mobilizing our economy and resources in the United States. And I merely say that if they elect me president, I will do my best to carry the United States through a difficult period. But I would not want people to elect me because I promised them the easy, soft life. I think it's going to be difficult, but I'm confident that this country can meet its responsibilities.
Mr. Vice President?
Well, I think we should be under no illusions whatever about what the responsibilities of the American people will be in the 60s. Our expenditures for defense, our expenditures for mutual security, our expenditures for economic assistance and technical assistance are not going to get less. In my opinion, they're going to be greater. I think it may be necessary that we have more taxes. I hope not. I hope we can economize elsewhere so that we don't have to. But I would have no hesitation to ask the American people to pay the taxes even in 1961, if necessary, to maintain a sound economy and also to maintain a sound dollar. Because when you do not tax, and tax enough to pay for your outgo, you pay it many times over in higher prices in inflation. And I simply will not do that. I think I should also add that as far as Senator Kennedy's proposals are concerned, if he intends to carry out his platform, the one adopted in Los Angeles, it is just impossible for him to make good on those promises without raising taxes or without having a rise in prices or both. The platform suggests that it can be done through economic growth, that it can be done in effect with mirrors, but it isn't going to be working that way. You can't add billions of dollars to our expenditures and not pay for it. After all, it isn't paid for by my money, it isn't paid for by his, but by the people's money.
Mr. Niven with a question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, you have said that while Mr. Khrushchev is here, Senator Kennedy should talk about what's right with this country as well as what's wrong with the country. In the 1952 campaign, when you were a Republican candidate for vice president, and we were at war with the communists, did you feel a similar responsibility to talk about what was right with the country?
I did, and as I pointed out in 1952, I have made it very clear that as far as the Korean War was concerned, that I felt that the decision to go into the war in Korea was right and necessary. What I criticized were the policies that made it necessary to go to Korea. Now, incidentally, I should point out here that Senator Kennedy has attacked our foreign policy. He said that it's been a policy that has led to defeat and retreat. And I'd like to know, where have we been defeated and where have we retreated? In the Truman administration, 600 million people went behind the Iron Curtain, including the satellite countries of Eastern Europe and communist China. In this administration, we've stopped them at Quemoy and Matsu. We've stopped them in Indochina. We've stopped them in Lebanon. We've stopped them in other parts of the world. I would also like to point out that as far as Senator Kennedy's comments are concerned, I think he has a perfect right and a responsibility to criticize this administration whenever he thinks we're wrong. But he has a responsibility to be accurate and not to misstate the case. I don't think he should say that our prestige is at an all-time low. I think this is very harmful at a time Mr. Khrushchev is here, harmful because it's wrong. I don't think it was helpful when he suggested, and I'm glad he's corrected this to an extent, that 17 million people go to bed hungry every night in the United States. Now, this just wasn't true. Now, there are people who go to bed hungry in the United States, far less, incidentally, than used to go to bed hungry when we came into power at the end of the Truman administration. But the thing that is right about the United States that should be emphasized is that less people go to bed hungry in the United States than in any major country in the world. We're the best fed, we're the best clothed, with a better distribution of this world's goods to all of our people than any people in history. Now, in pointing out the things that are wrong, I think we ought to emphasize America's strength. It isn't necessary to run America down in order to build her up. Now, just so we get it absolutely clear, Senator Kennedy must, as a candidate, as I as a candidate in 52, criticize us when we're wrong. And he's doing a very effective job of that in his way. But on the other hand, he has a responsibility to be accurate. And I have a responsibility to correct him every time he misstates the case. And I intend to continue to do so.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, Mr. Nixon, I'll just give you the testimony of Mr. George Aiken, Senator George Aiken, the ranking minority member, Republican member, and former chairman of the Senate Agricultural Committee, testifying in 1959, said there were 26 million Americans who did not have the income to afford a decent diet. Mr. Benson, testifying on the food stamp plan in 1957, said there were 25 million Americans who could not afford a elementary low-cost diet. And he defined that as someone who uses beans in place of meat. Now, I've seen a good many, hundreds of thousands of people who are not adequately fed. You can't tell me that a surplus food distribution of 5 cents per person, and there are nearly 6 million Americans receiving that, is adequate. You can't tell me anyone who uses beans instead of meat in the United States, and there are 25 million of them, according to Mr. Benson, is well fed or adequately fed. I believe that we should not compare what our figures may be to India or some other country that has serious problems, but to remember that we are the most prosperous country in the world and that these people are not getting adequate food. And they're not getting, in many cases, adequate shelter. And we ought to try to meet the problem. Secondly, Mr. Nixon has continued to state, and he stated it last week, these fantastic figures of what the Democratic budget platform would cost. They're wholly inaccurate. I said last week I believed in a balanced budget. Unless there was a severe recession, and after all, the worst unbalanced budget in history was in 1958 $12 billion, larger than in any administration in the history of the United States. So that I believe that on this subject, we can balance the budget unless we have a national emergency or unless we have a severe recession.
Mr. Morgan with a question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator, Saturday on television, you said that you had always thought that Quemoy and Matsu were unwise places to draw our defense line in the Far East. Would you comment further on that and also address to this question, couldn't a pullback from those islands be interpreted as appeasement?
Well, the United States has on occasion attempted, mostly in the middle 50s, to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to pull his troops back to Formosa. I believe strongly in the defense of Formosa. These islands are a few miles, 5 or 6 miles off the coast of Red China within a general harbor area and more than 100 miles from Formosa. We have never said flatly that we will defend Quemoy and Matsu if it's attacked. We say we will defend it if it's part of a general attack on Formosa, but it's extremely difficult to make that judgment. Now, Mr. Herta, in 1958, when he was Under Secretary of State, said they were strategically undefensible. Admiral Spruance and Collins in 1955 said that we should not attempt to defend these islands in their conference in the Far East. General Ridgway has said the same thing. I believe that when you get into a war, if you're going to get into a war for the defense of Formosa, it ought to be on a clearly defined line. One of the problems, I think, at the time of South Korea was the question of whether the United States would defend it if it were attacked. I believe that we should defend Formosa. We should come to its defense. To leave this rather in the air, that we will defend it under some conditions but not under other, I think is a mistake. Secondly, I would not suggest the withdrawal at the point of the communist gun. It is a decision finally that the nationalists should make. And I believe that we should consult with them and attempt to work out a plan by which the line is drawn at the island of Formosa. It leaves 100 miles between the seas. But with General Ridgway, Mr. Herta, General Collins, Admiral Spruance, and many others, I think it's unwise to take the chance of being dragged into a war which may lead to a world war over two islands which are not strategically defensible, which are not, according to their testimony, essential to the defense of Formosa. I think that we should protect our commitments. I believe strongly we should do so in Berlin. I believe strongly we should do so in Formosa. And I believe we should meet our commitments to every country whose security we've guaranteed. But I do not believe that that line, in case of a war, should be drawn on those islands, but instead on the island of Formosa. And as long as they are not essential to the defense of Formosa, it's been my judgment ever since 1954, at the time of the Eisenhower Doctrine for the Far East, that our line should be drawn in the sea around the island itself.
Mr. Vice President.
I disagree completely with Senator Kennedy on this point. I remember in the period immediately before the Korean War, South Korea was supposed to be indefensible as well. Generals testified to that. And Secretary Atchison made a very famous speech at the press club early in the year that Korean War started, indicating in effect that South Korea was beyond the defense zone of the United States. I suppose it was hoped when he made that speech that we wouldn't get into a war, but it didn't mean that. We had to go in when they came in. Now, I think as far as Quemoy and Matsu are concerned, that the question is not these two little pieces of real estate. They are unimportant. It isn't the few people who live on them. They are not too important. It's the principle involved. These two islands are in the area of freedom. The nationalists have these two islands. We should not force our nationalist allies to get off of them and give them to the communists. If we do that, we start a chain reaction, because the communists aren't after Quemoy and Matsu. They're after Formosa. In my opinion, this is the same kind of woolly thinking that led to disaster for America in Korea. I'm against it. I would never tolerate it as President of the United States, and I will hope that Senator Kennedy will change his mind if he should be elected.
Gentlemen, we have approximately 4 minutes remaining. May I ask you to make your questions and answers as brief as possible, consistent with clarity. And Mr. Levy has a question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, you are urging voters to forget party labels and vote for the man. Senator Kennedy says that in doing this, you are trying to run away from your party on such issues as housing and aid to education by advocating what he calls a Me Too program. Why do you say that party labels are not important?
Because that's the way we elect a president in this country, and it's the way we should. I am a student of history, as is Senator Kennedy, incidentally. And I have found that in the history of this country, we've had many great presidents. Some of them have been Democrats, and some of them have been Republicans. The people, some way, have always understood that at a particular time, a certain man was the one the country needed. Now, I believe that in an election, when we are trying to determine who should lead the free world, not just America, perhaps, as Senator Kennedy has already indicated, the most important election in our history, it isn't the label that he wears or that I wear that counts. It's what we are. It's our whole lives. It's what we stand for. It's what we believe. And consequently, I don't think it's enough to go before Republican audiences, and I never do, and say, look, vote for me because I'm a Republican. I don't think it's enough for Senator Kennedy to go before the audiences on the Democratic side and say, vote for me because I'm a Democrat. That isn't enough. What's involved here is the question of leadership for the whole free world. Now, that means the best leadership. It may be Republican, it may be Democratic, but the people are the ones that determine it. The people have to make up their minds. And I believe the people, therefore, should be asked to make up their minds, not simply on the basis of vote the way your grandfather did, vote the way your mother did. I think the people should put America first rather than party first. Now, as far as running away from my party is concerned, Senator Kennedy has said that we have no compassion for the poor, that we are against progress. The enemies of progress is the term that he's used and the like. All that I can say is this. We do have programs in all of these fields, education, housing, defense, that will move America forward. They will move her forward faster, and they will move her more surely than his program. This is what I deeply believe. I'm sure he believes just as deeply that his will move that way. I would suggest, however, that in the interest of fairness, that he could give me the benefit of also believing as he believes.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, let me say I do think that parties are important in that they tell something about the program and something about the man. Abraham Lincoln was a great president of all the people, but he was selected by his party at a key time in history because his party stood for something. The Democratic Party in this century has stood for something. It has stood for progress. It has stood for concern for the people's welfare. It has stood for a strong foreign policy and a strong national defense, and as a result, produced Wilson, President Roosevelt, and President Truman. The Republican Party has produced McKinley and Harding, Coolidge, and Dewey, and Landon. They do stand for something. They stand for a whole different approach to the problems facing this country at home and abroad. That's the importance of party, only if it tells something about the record. And the Republicans in recent years, not only in the last 25 years, but in the last 8 years, have opposed housing, opposed care for the aged, opposed federal aid to education, opposed minimum wage. And I think that record tells something.
Thank you, gentlemen. Neither the questions from the reporters nor the answers you heard from Senator John Kennedy or Vice President Richard Nixon were rehearsed. By agreement, neither candidate made an opening statement or a closing summation. They further agreed that the clock alone would decide who would speak last, and each has asked me to express his thanks to the networks and their affiliated stations. Another program similar to this one will be presented Thursday, October 13th, and the final program will be presented Friday, October 21st. We hope this series of radio and television programs will help you toward a fuller understanding of the issues facing our country today, and that on Election Day, November 8th, you will vote for the candidate of your choice. This is Frank McGee. Good night from Washington.
Good evening. I'm Bill Shadell of ABC News. It's my privilege this evening to preside at this, the third in the series of meetings on radio and television of the two major presidential candidates. Now, like the last meeting, the subjects to be discussed will be suggested by questions from a panel of correspondents. Unlike the first two programs, however, the two candidates will not be sharing the same platform. In New York, the Democratic presidential nominee, Senator John F. Kennedy. Separated by 3,000 miles in a Los Angeles studio, the Republican presidential nominee, Vice President Richard M. Nixon. Now joined for tonight's discussion by a network of electronic facilities which permits each candidate to see and hear the other. Good evening, Senator Kennedy.
Good evening, Mr. Shadell.
And good evening to you, Vice President Nixon.
Good evening, Mr. Shadell.
And now to meet the panel of correspondents. Frank McGee, NBC News. Charles Von Prem, CBS News. Douglas Cater, Reporter Magazine. Roscoe Drummond, New York Herald Tribune. Now, as you've probably noted, the four reporters include a newspaper man and a magazine reporter. These two selected by lot by the press secretaries of the candidates from among the reporters traveling with the candidates. The broadcasting representatives were chosen by their companies. The rules for this evening have been agreed upon by the representatives of both candidates in the radio and television networks, and I should like to read them. There will be no opening statements by the candidates nor any closing summation. The entire hour will be devoted to answering questions from the reporters. Each candidate to be questioned in turn with opportunity for comment by the other. Each answer will be limited to 2.5 minutes, each comment to 1.5 minutes. The reporters are free to ask any question they choose on any subject. Neither candidate knows what questions will be asked. Time alone will be determine who will be asked the final question. Now, the first question is from Mr. McGee and is for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, yesterday you used the words trigger happy in referring to Vice President Richard Nixon's stand on defending the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. Last week, on a program like this one, you said the next president would come face to face with a serious crisis in Berlin. So the question is, would you take military action to defend Berlin?
Mr. McGee, we have a contractual right to be in Berlin, coming out of the conversations at Potsdam, end of World War II. That has been reinforced by direct commitments of the President of the United States. It's been reinforced by a number of other nations under NATO. I have stated on many occasions that the United States must meet its commitment on Berlin. It is a commitment that we have to meet if we're going to protect the security of Western Europe. And therefore, on this question, I don't think that there is any doubt in the mind of any American. I hope there is not any doubt in the mind of any member of the community of West Berlin. I'm sure there isn't any doubt in the mind of the Russians. We will meet our commitments to maintain the freedom and independence of West Berlin.
Mr. Vice President, do you wish to comment?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the statement that Senator Kennedy made was that to the effect that there were trigger-happy Republicans, that my stand on Quemoy and Matsu was an indication of trigger-happy Republicans. I resent that comment. I resent it because it's an implication that Republicans have been trigger-happy and therefore would lead this nation into war. I would remind Senator Kennedy of the past 50 years. I would ask him to name one Republican president who led this nation into war. There were 3 Democratic presidents who led us into war. I do not mean by that one party is a war party and the other party is a peace party. But I do say that any statement to the effect that the Republican Party is trigger-happy is belied by the record. We had a war when we came into power in 1953. We got rid of that. We've kept out of other wars. And certainly that doesn't indicate that we're trigger-happy. We've been strong, but we haven't been trigger-happy. As far as Berlin is concerned, there isn't any question about the necessity of defending Berlin, the rights of people there to be free, and there isn't any question about what the united American people, Republicans and Democrats alike, would do in the event there were an attempt by the communists to take over in Berlin.
The next question is by Mr. Von Prem for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, a 2-part question concerning the offshore islands in the Formosa Straits. If you were president and the Chinese communists tomorrow began an invasion of Quemoy and Matsu, would you launch the United States into a war by sending the 7th Fleet and other military forces to resist this aggression? And secondly, if the regular conventional forces fail to halt such an invasion, would you authorize the use of nuclear weapons?
Mr. Von Prem, it would be completely irresponsible for a candidate for the presidency or for a president himself to indicate the course of action and the weapons he would use in the event of such an attack. I will say this. In the event that such an attack occurred, and in the event the attack was a prelude to an attack on Formosa, which would be the indication today, because the Chinese communists say over and over again that their objective is not the offshore islands, that they consider them only stepping stones to taking Formosa. In the event that their attack then were a prelude to an attack on Formosa, there isn't any question but that the United States would then again, as in the case of Berlin, honor our treaty obligations and stand by our ally of Formosa. But to indicate in advance how we would respond, to indicate the nature of his response would be incorrect. It would certainly be inappropriate. It would not be in the best interest of the United States. I will only say this, however, in addition. To do what Senator Kennedy has suggested, to suggest that we will surrender these islands or force our Chinese nationalist allies to surrender them in advance, is not something that would lead to peace. It is something that would lead, in my opinion, to war. This is the history of dealing with dictators. This is something that Senator Kennedy and all Americans must know. We tried this with Hitler. It didn't work. He wanted first, we know, Austria, and then he went on to the Sudetenland and then Danzig, and each time it was thought this is all that he wanted. Now, what do the Chinese communists want? They don't want just Quemoy and Matsu. They don't want just Formosa. They want the world. And the question is, if you surrender or indicate in advance that you're not going to defend any part of the free world, and you figure that's going to satisfy them, it doesn't satisfy them. It only whets their appetite. And then the question comes, when do you stop them? I have often heard President Eisenhower, in discussing this question, make the statement that if we once start the process of indicating that this point or that point is not the place to stop those who threaten the peace and freedom of the world, where do we stop them? And I say that those of us who stand against surrender, this or any others, in the face of blackmail, in the face of force by the communists, are standing for the course that will lead to peace.
Senator Kennedy, do you wish to...
The islands which Mr. Nixon is discussing are 5 or 4 miles, respectively, off the coast of China. Now, when Senator Green, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote to the president, he received back on the 2nd of October, 1958, neither you nor any other American need feel the U.S. will be involved in military hostilities merely in the defense of Chimoya-Matsu. Now, that is the issue. I believe we must meet our commitment to Formosa. I support it, and the Pescadores Islands. That is the present American position. The treaty does not include these 2 islands. Mr. Nixon suggests that the United States should go to war if these 2 islands are attacked. I suggest that if Formosa is attacked, or the Pescadores, or if there's any military action in any area which indicates an attack on Formosa and the Pescadores, then, of course, the United States is at war to defend its treaty. Now, I must say what Mr. Nixon wants to do is commit us, as I understand him, so that we can be clear if there's a disagreement. He wants us to be committed to the defense of these islands, merely as the defense of these islands as free territory, not as part of the defense of Formosa. Admiral Yarnell, the commander of the Asiatic Fleet, has said that these islands are not worth the bones of a single American. The President of the United States has indicated they are not within the treaty area. They were not within the treaty area when the treaty was passed in 55. We have attempted to persuade Chiang Kai-shek as late as January of 1959 to reduce the number of troops he has on there. This is a serious issue, and I think we ought to understand completely if we disagree, and if so, where.
Mr. Cater has the next question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, last week you said that before we should hold another summit conference, that it was important that the United States build its strength. Modern weapons take quite a long time to build. What sort of prolonged period do you envisage before there can be a summit conference? And do you think that there can be any new initiatives on the grounds of nuclear disarmament, nuclear control, or weapons control during this period?
Well, I think we should strengthen our conventional forces, and we should attempt in January, February, and March of next year to increase the airlift capacity of our conventional forces. Then I believe that we should move full-time on our missile production, particularly on Minuteman and on Polaris. It may be a long period, but we must get started immediately. Now, on the question of disarmament, particularly nuclear disarmament, I must say that I feel that another effort should be made by a new administration in January of 1961 to renew negotiations with the Soviet Union and see whether it's possible to come to some conclusion which will lessen the chances of contamination of the atmosphere and also lessen the chances that other powers will begin to possess a nuclear capacity. There are indications because of new inventions that 10, 15, or 20 nations will have a nuclear capacity, including Red China, by the end of the presidential office in 1964. This is extremely serious. There have been many wars in the history of mankind, and to take a chance now and not make every effort that we could make to provide for some control over these weapons, I think would be a great mistake. One of my disagreements with the present administration has been that I don't feel a real effort has been made on this very sensitive subject, not only of nuclear control, but also of general disarmament. Less than 100 people have been working throughout the entire federal government on this subject, and I believe it's been reflected in our success and failures at Geneva. Now, we may not succeed. The Soviet Union may not agree to an inspection system. We may not be able to get satisfactory assurances. It may be necessary for us to begin testing again. But I hope the next administration, and if I have anything to do with it, the next administration will, make one last great effort to provide for control of nuclear testing, control of nuclear weapons, if possible, control of outer space, free from weapons, and also to begin again the subject of general disarmament levels. These must be done. If we cannot succeed, then we must strengthen ourselves. But I would make the effort, because I think the fate not only of our own civilization, but I think the fate of the world and the future of the human race is involved in preventing a nuclear war.
Mr. Vice President, your comment?
Yes, I am going to make a major speech on this whole subject next week before the next debate, and I will have an opportunity then to answer any other questions that may arise with regard to my position on it. There isn't any question but that we must move forward in every possible way to reduce the danger of war, to move toward controlled disarmament, to control tests. But also, let's have in mind this. When Senator Kennedy suggests that we haven't been making an effort, he simply doesn't know what he's talking about. It isn't a question of the number of people who are working in an administration. It's a question of who they are. This has been one of the highest level operations in the whole State Department, right under the President himself. We have gone certainly the extra mile and then some in making offers to the Soviet Union on control of tests, on disarmament, and in every other way. And I just want to make one thing very clear. Yes, we should make a great effort, but under no circumstances must the United States ever make an agreement based on trust. There must be an absolute guarantee. Now, just to comment on Senator Kennedy's last answer. He forgets that in this same debate on the Formosa resolution, which he said he voted for, which he did, that he voted against an amendment, or was recorded against an amendment, and on this particular, or for an amendment, I should say, which passed the Senate overwhelmingly, 70-12. And that amendment put the Senate of the United States on record, with the majority of the senator's own party voting for it, as well as the majority of the Republicans, put them on record against the very position that the senator takes now of surrendering, of indicating in advance that the United States will not defend the offshore islands.
The next question is by Mr. Drummond for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Nixon, I would like to ask one more aspect, or raise another aspect of this same question. It is my understanding that President Eisenhower never advocated that Quemoy and Matsu should be defended under all circumstances as a matter of principle. I heard Secretary Dulles at a press conference in '58 say that he thought that it was a mistake for Chiang Kai-shek to deploy troops to these islands. I would like to ask, what has led you to take what appears to be a different position on this subject?
Well, Mr. Drummond, first of all, referring to Secretary Dulles' press conference, I think if you read it all, and I know that you have, you will find that Secretary Dulles also indicated in that press conference that when the troops were withdrawn from Quemoy, that the implication was, certainly of everything that he said, that Quemoy could better be defended. There were too many infantrymen there, not enough heavy artillery. And certainly I don't think there was any implication in Secretary Dulles' statement that Quemoy and Matsu should not be defended in the event that they were attacked, and that attack was a preliminary to an attack on Formosa. Now, as far as President Eisenhower is concerned, I have often heard him discuss this question. As I related a moment ago, the President has always indicated that we must not make the mistake in dealing with the dictator of indicating that we are going to make a concession at the point of a gun. Whenever you do that, inevitably the dictator is encouraged to try it again. So first it will be Quemoy and Matsu. Next it may be Formosa. What do we do then? My point is this, that once you do this, follow this course of action, of indicating that you are not going to defend a particular area, the inevitable result is that it encourages a man who is determined to conquer the world to press you to the point of no return, and that means war. We went through this tragic experience leading to World War II. We learned our lesson again in Korea. We must not learn it again. That is why I think the Senate was right, including a majority of the Democrats, a majority of the Republicans, when they rejected Senator Kennedy's position in 1955. And incidentally, Senator Johnson was among those who rejected that position, voted with the 70 against the 12. The Senate was right because they knew the lesson of history. And may I say, too, that I would trust that Senator Kennedy would change his position on this. Change it. Because as long as he, as a major presidential candidate, continues to suggest that we are going to turn over these islands, he is only encouraging the aggressors, the Chinese communists and the Soviet aggressors, to press the United States, to press us to the point where war would be inevitable. The road to war is always paved with good intentions. And in this instance, the good intentions, of course, are a desire for peace. But certainly we're not going to have peace by giving in and indicating in advance that we are not going to defend what has become a symbol of freedom.
Senator Kennedy.
I don't think it's possible for Mr. Nixon to state the record in distortion of the facts with more precision than he just did. In 1955, Mr. Dulles at a press conference said, "The treaty that we have with the Republic of China excludes Quemoy and Matsu from the treaty area. That was done with much thought and deliberation. Therefore, that treaty does not commit the United States to defend anything except Formosa and the Pescadores and to deal with acts against that treaty area. I completely sustained the treaty. I voted for it. I would take any action necessary to defend the treaty, Formosa, and the Pescadores Island. What we're now talking about is the Vice President's determination to guarantee Quemoy and Matsu, which are 4 and 5 miles off the coast of Red China, which are not within the treaty area. I do not suggest that Chiang Kai-shek and this administration has been attempting since 1955 to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to lessen his troop commitments. He sent a mission, the President, in 1955 of Mr. Robertson and Admiral Radford. General Twining said they were still doing it in 1959. General Ridgway said, who was Chief of Staff, to go to war for Quemoy and Matsu, to me would seem an unwarranted and tragic course to take. To me, that concept is completely repugnant. So I stand with them. I stand with the Secretary of State, Mr. Herter, who said these islands were indefensible. I believe that we should meet our commitments. And if the Chinese communists attack the Pescadores and Formosa, they know that it will mean a war. I would not hand over these islands under any point of gun. But I merely say that the treaty is quite precise, and I sustain the treaty. Mr. Nixon would add a guarantee to islands 5 miles off the coast of the Republic of China when he's never really protested the communists seizing Cuba 90 miles off the coast of the United States.
Mr. Von Fremd has a question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, I'd like to shift the conversation, if I may, to a domestic political argument. The chairman of the Republican National Committee, Senator Thurston Morton, declared earlier this week that you owed Vice President Nixon and the Republican Party a public apology for some strong charges made by former President Harry Truman, who bluntly suggested where the Vice President and the Republican Party could go. Do you feel that you owe the Vice President an apology?
Well, I must say that Mr. Truman has his methods of expressing things. He's been in politics for 50 years. He's been President of the United States. Maybe not my style, but I really don't think there's anything that I can say to President Truman that's going to cause him at the age of 76 to change his particular speaking manner. Perhaps Mrs. Truman can, but I don't think I can. I just have to tell Mr. Morton that. If you'd pass that message on to him.
Any comment, Mr. Vice President?
Yes, I think so. Of course, both Senator Kennedy and I have felt Mr. Truman's ire, and consequently, I think he can speak with some feeling on this subject. I just do want to say one thing, however. We all have tempers. I have one. I'm sure Senator Kennedy has one. But when a man's President of the United States or a former president he has an obligation not to lose his temper in public. One thing I have noted as I've traveled around the country are the tremendous number of children who come out to see the presidential candidates. I see mothers holding their babies up so that they can see a man who might be president of the United States. I know Senator Kennedy sees them too. It makes you realize that whoever is president is going to be a man that all the children of America will either look up to or will look down to. And I can only say that I'm very proud that President Eisenhower restored dignity and decency and, frankly, good language to the conduct of the presidency of the United States. And I only hope that, should I win this election, that I could approach President Eisenhower in maintaining the dignity of the office, in seeing to it that whenever any mother or father talks to his child, he can look at the man in the White House, and whatever he may think of his policies, he will say, well, there is a man who maintains the kind of standards personally that I would want my child to follow.
Mr. Cater's question is for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, I'd like to return just once more, if I may, to this area of dealing with the communists. Critics have claimed that on at least 3 occasions in recent years, on the sending of American troops to Indochina in 1954, on the matter of continuing the U-2 flights in May, and then on this definition of our commitment to the offshore island, that you have overstated the administration position, that you have taken a more bellicose position than President Eisenhower. Just 2 days ago, you said that you called on Senator Kennedy to serve notice to communist aggressors around the world that we're not going to retreat 1 inch more any place, whereas we did retreat from the Tachin Islands, or at least Chiang Kai-shek did. Would you say this was a valid criticism of your statement of foreign policy?
Well, Mr. Cater, of course it's a criticism that is being made. I obviously don't think it's valid. I have supported the administration's position, and I think that that position has been correct. I think my position has been correct. As far as Indochina is concerned, I stated over and over again that it was essential during that period that the United States make it clear that we would not tolerate Indochina falling under communist domination. Now, as a result of our taking the strong stand that we did, the civil war there was ended. And today, at least in the south of Indochina, the communists have moved out, and we do have a strong, free bastion there. Now, looking to the U-2 flights, I would like to point out that I have been supporting the president's position throughout. I think the president was correct in ordering these flights. I think the president was correct, certainly, in his decision to continue the flights while the conference was going on. I noted, for example, in reading a particular discussion that Senator Kennedy had with Dave Garraway shortly after his statement about regrets, that he made the statement that he felt that these particular flights were ones that shouldn't have occurred right at that time. And the indication was, how would Mr. Khrushchev have felt if we had had a flight over how would we have felt if Mr. Khrushchev had a flight over the United States while he was visiting here? And the answer, of course, is that communist espionage goes on all the time. The answer is that the United States can't afford to have an espionage lag, or should I say an intelligence lag, any more than we can afford to have a missile lag. Now, referring to your question with regard to Quemoy and Matsu, what I object to here is the constant reference to surrendering these islands. Senator Kennedy quotes the record, which he read from a moment ago. But what he forgets to point out is that the key vote, a vote which I referred to several times, where he was in the minority, was one which rejected his position. Now, why did they reject it? For the very reason that those senators knew, as the President of the United States knew, that you should not indicate to the communists in advance that you're going to surrender an area that's free. Why? Because they know, as Senator Kennedy will have to know, that if you do that, you encourage them to more aggression.
Senator Kennedy?
Well, number one, on Indochina, Mr. Nixon talked before the newspaper editors in the spring of 1954 about putting, and I quote him, American boys into Indochina. The reason Indochina was preserved was a result of the Geneva Conference, which petitioned Indochina. Number two, on the question of the U-2 flights, I thought the U-2 flight in May, just before the conference, was a mistake in timing because of the hazards involved if the summit conference had any hope for success. I never criticized the U-2 flights in general, however. I never suggested espionage should stop. It still goes on, I would assume, on both sides. Number three, the Vice President on May 15th, after the U-2 flight, indicated that the flights were going on, even though the administration and the President had canceled the flights on May 12th. Number three, the Vice President suggests that we should keep the communists in doubt about whether we would fight on Kimoyamatsu. That's not the position he's taking. He's indicating that we should fight for these islands, come what may, because they are, in his words, in the area of freedom. He didn't take that position on Tibet. He didn't take that position on Budapest. He doesn't take that position that I've seen so far in Laos. Guinea and Ghana have both moved within the Soviet sphere of influence in foreign policy. So is Cuba. I merely say that the United States should meet its commitments to Formosa and the Pescadores. But as Admiral Yarnell has said, and he's been supported by most military authority, these islands that we're now talking about are not worth the bones of a single American soldier. And I know how difficult it is to sustain troops close to the shore under artillery bombardment. And therefore, I think we should make it very clear the disagreement between Mr. Nixon and myself. He's extending the administration's commitment.
Mr. Drummond's question is for Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Kennedy, Representative Adam Clayton Powell, in the course of his speaking tour in your behalf, is saying, and I quote, "The Ku Klux Klan is riding again in this campaign. If it doesn't stop, all bigots will vote for Nixon, and all right-thinking Christians and Jews will vote for Kennedy rather than be found in the ranks of the Klan-minded." End quotation. Governor Michael DeSalle is saying much the same thing. What I would like to ask Senator Kennedy is, what is the purpose of this sort of thing, and how do you feel about it?
Well, Mr. Griffin, I believe, who is the head of the Klan, who lives in Tampa, Florida, indicated in a statement, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, that he was not going to vote for me and that he was going to vote for Mr. Nixon. I do not suggest in any way, nor have I ever, that indicates that Mr. Nixon has the slightest sympathy, involvement, or in any way imply any inferences in regard to the Ku Klux Klan. That's absurd. I don't suggest that. I don't support it. I would disagree with it. Mr. Nixon knows very well that in this whole matter, it's been involved in the so-called religious discussion in this campaign. I have never suggested, even by the vaguest implication, that he did anything but disapprove of it. And that's my view now. I disapprove of the issue. I do not suggest that Mr. Nixon does in any way.
Mr. Vice President.
Well, I welcome this opportunity to join Senator Kennedy completely on that statement and to say before this largest television audience in history something that I have been saying in the past and will always say in the future. On our last television debate, I pointed out that it was my position that Americans must choose the best man that either party could produce. We can't settle for anything but the best. And that means, of course, the best man that this nation can produce. And that means that we can't have any test of religion. We can't have any test of race. It must be a test of the man. Also, as far as religion is concerned, I have seen communism abroad. I see what it does. Communism is the enemy of all religions. And we who do believe in God must join together. We must not be divided on this issue. The worst thing that I can think can happen in this campaign would be for it to be decided on religious issues. I obviously repudiate the Klan. I repudiate anybody who uses the religious issue. I will not tolerate it. I have ordered all of my people to have nothing to do with it. And I say to this great audience, whoever may be listening, remember, if you believe in America, if you want America to set the right example to the world, that we cannot have religious or racial prejudice. We cannot have it in our hearts, but we certainly cannot have it in a presidential campaign.
Question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, some of your early campaign literature said you were making a study to see if new laws were needed to protect the public against excessive use of power by labor unions. Have you decided whether such new laws are needed, and if so, what would they do?
Mr. McGee, I am planning a speech on that subject next week, also so that we can get the opportunity for the questioners to question me, it will be before the next television debate. I will say simply in advance of it that I believe that in this area, the laws which should be passed as far as the big national emergency strikes are concerned are ones that will give the president more weapons with which to deal with those strikes. Now, I have a basic disagreement with Senator Kennedy, though, on this point. He has taken the position. He first indicated in October of last year that he would even favor compulsory arbitration as one of the weapons the president might have to stop a national emergency strike. I understand in his last speech before the Steelworkers Union that he changed that position and indicated that he felt that government seizure might be the best way to stop a strike which could not be settled by collective bargaining. I do not believe we should have either compulsory arbitration or seizure. I think the moment that you give to the union on the one side and the management on the other side the escape hatch of eventually going to government to get it settled, that most of these great strikes will end up being settled by government, and that will be in the end, in my opinion, wage control. It will mean price control, all the things that we do not want. I do believe, however, that we can give to the President of the United States powers in addition to what he presently has in the fact-finding area, which would enable him to be more effective than we have been in handling these strikes. One last point I should make. The record in handling them has been very good during this administration. We have had less man-hours lost by strikes in these last 7 years than we had in the previous 7 years by a great deal. And I only want to say that however good the record is, it's got to be better. Because in this critical year period of the 60s, we've got to move forward. All Americans must move forward together, and we have to get the greatest cooperation possible between labor and management. We cannot afford stoppages of massive effect on the economy when we're in the terrible competition we're in with the Soviets.
Senator, your comment?
Well, I always have difficulty recognizing my positions when they're stated by the Vice President. I never suggested that compulsory arbitration was a solution for national emergency disputes. I'm opposed to that. Was opposed to it in October 1958. I have suggested that the President should be given other weapons to protect the national interest in case of national emergency strikes beyond the injunction provision of the Taft-Hartley Act. I don't know what other weapons the Vice President is talking about. I'm talking about giving him 4 or 5 tools, not only the fact-finding committee that he now has under the injunction provision, not only the injunction, but also the power of the fact-finding commission to make recommendations which would not be binding, but nevertheless would have great force of public opinion behind them. One of the additional powers that I would suggest would be seizure. There might be others. By the President having 5 powers, 4 or 5 powers, and he only has very limited powers today, neither the company nor the union would be sure which power would be used. And therefore, there would be a greater incentive on both sides to reach an agreement themselves without taking it to the government. The difficulty now is the President's course is quite limited. He can set up a fact-finding committee. The fact-finding committee's powers are limited. He can provide an injunction if there's a national emergency for 80 days. Then the strike can go on. And there are no other powers or actions that the President could take unless he went to the Congress. This is a difficult and sensitive matter. But to state my view precisely, the President should have a variety of things he could do. He could leave the parties in doubt as to which one he would use. And therefore, there would be incentive, instead of as now, the steel companies were ready to take the strike because they felt the injunction of 80 days would break the union, which didn't happen.
The next question is by Mr. Cater for Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Kennedy, Vice President Nixon says that he has costed the two-party platforms and that yours would run at least $10 billion a year more than his. You have denied his figures. He has called on you to supply your figures. Would you do that?
Yes, I have stated in both the debates and state again that I believe in a balanced budget and have supported that concept during my 14 years in the Congress. The only 2 times when an unbalanced budget is warranted would be during a serious recession, and we had that in 58 in an unbalanced budget of $12 billion, or a national emergency where there should be large expenditures for national defense, which we had in World War II and during part of the Korean War. On the question of the cost of our budget, I have stated that it's my best judgment that our agricultural program will cost $1.5 billion, possibly $2 billion less than the present agricultural program. My judgment is that the program the Vice President put forward, which is an extension of Mr. Benson's program, will cost $1 billion more than the present program, which costs about $6 billion a year, the most expensive in history. We spent more money on agriculture in the last 8 years than the 100 years of the agricultural department before that. Secondly, I believe that the high interest rate policy that this administration has followed has added about $3 billion a year to interest on the debt, merely funding the debt, which is a burden on the taxpayers. I would hope under a different monetary policy it would be possible to reduce that interest rate burden, at least $1 billion. Third, I think it's possible to gain a $700 million to $1 billion through tax changes, which I believe would close up loopholes on dividend withholding, on expense accounts. Fourthly, I have suggested that the medical care for the aged and the bill which the Congress now has passed and the President signed, if fully implemented, would cost $1 billion on the Treasury out of the Treasury Fund and $1 billion by the states. The proposal that I have put forward and which many of the members of my party support is for medical care financed under Social Security, which would be financed under the Social Security tax system, which is less than 3 cents a day per person for medical care, doctors' bills, nurses, hospitals when they retire. It is actuarially sound. So in my judgment, we would spend more money in this administration on aid to education. We'd spend more money on housing. We'd spend more money, and I hope more wisely, on defense than this administration has done. But I believe that the next administration should work for a balanced budget, and that would be my intention. Mr. Nixon misstates my figures constantly, which is, of course, is right. But the fact of the matter is, here is where I stand, and I just want to have it on the public record.
Mr. Vice President?
Senator Kennedy has indicated on several occasions in this program tonight that I've been misstating his record and his figures. I will issue a white paper after this broadcast quoting exactly what he said on compulsory arbitration, for example, and the record will show that I have been correct. Now, as far as his figures are concerned here tonight, he again is engaging in this, what I would call mirror game of here it is and here it isn't. On the one hand, for example, he suggests that as far as his medical care program is concerned, that really isn't a problem because it's from Social Security. But Social Security is a tax. The people pay it. It comes right out of your paycheck. This doesn't mean that the people aren't going to be paying the bill. He also indicates, as far as his agricultural program is concerned, that he feels it will cost less than ours. Well, all that I can suggest is that all the experts who have studied the program indicate that it is the most fantastic program, the worst program insofar as its effect on the farmers that America has ever had foisted upon it in an election year or any other time. And I would also point out that Senator Kennedy left out a part of the cost of that program, a 25% rise in food prices that the people would have to pay. Now, are we going to have that when it isn't going to help the farmers? I don't think we should have that kind of a program. Then he goes on to say that he's going to change the interest rate situation and we're going to get some more money that way. Well, what he's saying there, in effect, we're going to have inflation. We're going to go right back to what we had under Mr. Truman when he had political control of the Federal Reserve Board. I don't believe we ought to pay our bills through inflation, through a phony interest rate.
Next, Mr. Drummond's question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Nixon, before the convention, you and Governor Rockefeller said jointly that the nation's economic growth ought to be accelerated. And the Republican platform states that the nation needs to quicken the pace of economic growth. Is it fair, therefore, Mr. Vice President, to conclude that you feel that there has been insufficient economic growth during the past 8 years? And if so, what would you do beyond present administration policies to step it up?
Mr. Drummond, I am never satisfied with the economic growth of this country. I'm not satisfied with it even if there were no communism in the world, but particularly when we're in the kind of a race we're in, we have got to see that America grows just as fast as we can, provided we grow soundly. Because even though we have maintained, as I pointed out in our first debate, the absolute gap over the Soviet Union, even though the growth in this administration has been twice as much as it was in the Truman administration, that isn't good enough. Because America must be able to grow enough not only to take care of our needs at home for better education and housing and health, all these things we want. We've got to grow enough to maintain the forces that we have abroad and to wage the non-military battle for the world, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. It's going to cost more money, and growth will help us to win that battle. Now, what do we do about it? And here, I believe, basically, that what we have to do is to stimulate that sector of America, the private enterprise sector of the economy, in which there is the greatest possibility for expansion. So that is why I advocate a program of tax reform, which will stimulate more investment in our economy. In addition to that, we have to move on other areas that are holding back growth. I refer, for example, to distressed areas. We have to move into those areas with programs so that we make adequate use of the resources of those areas. We also have to see that all of the people of the United States, the tremendous talents that our people have, are used adequately. That's why in this whole area of civil rights, the equality of opportunity for employment and education is not just for the benefit of the minority groups, it's for the benefit of the nation, so that we can get the scientists and the engineers and all the rest that we need. And in addition to that, we need programs, particularly in higher education, which will stimulate scientific breakthroughs, which will bring more growth. Now, what all this, of course, adds up to is this. America has not been standing still. Let's get that straight. Anybody who says America's been standing still for the last 7.5 years hasn't been traveling around America. He's been traveling in some other country. We have been moving. We have been moving much faster than we did in the Truman years. But we can and must move faster. And that's why I stand so strongly for programs that will move America forward in the 60s. Move her forward so that we can stay ahead of the Soviet Union and win the battle for freedom and peace.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, first, may I correct a statement which was made before that under my agricultural program, food prices would go up 25%. That's untrue. The farmer who grows wheat gets about 2.5 cents out of a 25-cent loaf of bread. Even if you put his income up 10%, that'd be 2 3/4%, 3 cents out of that 25 cents. The man who grows tomatoes, it costs less for those tomatoes than it does for the label on the can. And I believe when the average hour for many farmers' wage is about 50 cents an hour, he should do better. But anybody who suggests that that program would come to any figure indicated by the Vice President is in error. The Vice President suggested a number of things. He suggested that we aid distressed areas. The administration has vetoed that bill passed by the Congress twice. He suggested we pass an aid to education bill. The administration and the Republican majority in the Congress has opposed any realistic aid to education. And the Vice President cast a deciding vote against federal aid for teacher salaries in the Senate, which prevented that being added. This administration and this country last year had the lowest rate of economic growth, which means jobs, of any major industrialized society in the world in 1959. And when we have to find 25,000 new jobs a week for the next 10 years, we're going to have to grow more. Governor Rockefeller says 5%. Democratic platform and others say 5%. Many say 4.5%. The last 8 years, the average growth has been about 2.5%. That's why we don't have full employment today.
Mr. McGee has the next question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, a moment ago you mentioned tax loopholes. Now, your running mate, Senator Lyndon Johnson, is from Texas, an oil-producing state and one that many political leaders feel is in doubt in this election year. And reports from there say that oil men in Texas are seeking assurance from Senator Johnson that the oil depletion allowance will not be cut. The Democratic platform pledges to plug loopholes in the tax laws and refers to inequitable depletion allowance as being conspicuous loopholes. My question is, do you consider the 27.5% depletion allowance inequitable, and would you ask that it be cut?
Mr. McGee, there are about 104 commodities that have some kind of depletion allowance, different kind of minerals, including oil. I believe all of those should be gone over in detail to make sure that no one is getting a tax break, to make sure that no one is getting away from paying the taxes he ought to pay. That includes oil, it includes all kinds of minerals, it includes everything within the range of taxation. We want to be sure it's fair and equitable. It includes oil abroad. Perhaps that oil abroad should be treated differently than the oil here at home. Now, the oil industry recently has had hard times, particularly some of the smaller producers. They're moving about 8 or 9 days in Texas. But I can assure you that if I'm elected president, the whole spectrum of taxes will be gone through carefully, and if there's any inequities in oil or any other commodity, then I would vote to close that loophole. I have voted in the past to reduce the depletion allowance for the largest producers, for those from $5 million down, to maintain it at 27.5%. I believe we should study this and other allowances, tax expense, dividend expenses, and all the rest, and make a determination of how we can stimulate growth, how we can provide the revenues needed to move our country forward.
Mr. Vice President.
Senator Kennedy's position and mine are completely different on this. I favor the present depletion allowance. I favor it not because I want to make a lot of oil men rich, but because I want to make America rich. Why do we have a depletion allowance? Because this is the stimulation, the incentive for companies to go out and explore for oil, to develop it. If we didn't have a depletion allowance of certainly, I believe, the present amount, we would have our oil exploration cut substantially in this country. Now, as far as my position then is concerned, it is exactly opposite to the senators, and it's because of my belief that if America is going to have the growth that he talks about and that I talk about and that we want, the thing to do is not to discourage individual enterprise, not to discourage people to go out and discover more oil and minerals, but to encourage them. And so he would be doing exactly the wrong thing. One other thing. He suggests that there are a number of other items in this whole depletion field that could be taken into account. He also said a moment ago that we would get more money to finance his programs by revising the tax laws, including depletion. I should point out that as far as depletion allowances are concerned, the oil depletion allowance is one that provides 80% of all of those involved in depletion. So you're not going to get much from revenue insofar as depletion allowances are concerned unless you move in the area that he indicated. But I oppose it. I oppose it for the reasons that I mentioned. I oppose it because I want us to have more oil exploration and not less.
Gentlemen, if I may remind you, time is growing short, so please keep your questions and answers as brief as possible, consistent with clarity. Mr. Von Frem for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, in the past 3 years, there has been an exodus of more than $4 billion of gold from the United States, apparently for two reasons. Because exports have slumped and haven't covered imports, and because of increased American investments abroad. If you were president, how would you go about stopping this departure of gold from our shores?
Well, Mr. Von Frem, the first thing we have to do is to continue to keep confidence abroad in the American dollar. That means that we must continue to have a balanced budget here at home in every possible circumstance that we can. Because the moment that we have loss of confidence in our own fiscal policies at home, it results in gold flowing out. Secondly, we have to increase our exports as compared with our imports. And here we have a very strong program going forward in the Department of Commerce. This one must be stepped up. Beyond that, as far as the gold supply is concerned, and as far as the movement of gold is concerned, we have to bear in mind that we must get more help from our allies abroad in this great venture in which all free men are involved of winning the battle for freedom. Now, America has been carrying a tremendous load in this respect. I think we have been right in carrying it. I have favored our programs abroad for economic assistance and for military assistance. But now we find that the countries of Europe, for example, that we have aided, and Japan that we've aided in the Far East, these countries, some are former enemies, some are friends, have now recovered completely. They have got to bear a greater share of this load of economic assistance abroad. That's why I am advocating and will develop during the course of the next administration, if of course I get the opportunity, a program in which we enlist more aid from these other countries on a concerted basis in the programs of economic development for Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The United States cannot continue to carry the major share of this burden by itself. We can carry a big share of it, but we've got to have more help from our friends abroad, and these three factors, I think, will be very helpful in reversing the gold flow which you spoke about.
Senator Kennedy.
Just to correct the record, Mr. Nixon said on depletion that his record was the opposite of mine. What I said was that this matter should be thoroughly gone into to make sure that there aren't loopholes. If his record is the opposite of that, that means that he doesn't want to go into it. Now, on the question of the gold, the difficulty, of course, is that we do have heavy obligations abroad, that we therefore have to maintain not only a favorable balance of trade, but also send a good deal of our dollars overseas to pay our troops, maintain our bases, and sustain other economies. In other words, if we're going to continue to maintain our position in the 60s, we have to maintain a sound monetary and fiscal policy. We have to have control over inflation. And we also have to have a favorable balance of trade. We have to be able to compete in the world market. We have to be able to sell abroad more than we consume from abroad if we're going to be able to meet our obligations. In addition, many of the countries around the world still keep restrictions against our goods, going all the way back to the days when there was a dollar shortage. Now there isn't a dollar shortage, and yet many of these countries continue to move against our goods. I believe that we must be able to compete in the market, steel and in all the basic commodities abroad. We must be able to compete against them because we always did because of our technological lead. We have to be sure to maintain that. We have to persuade these other countries not to restrict our goods in coming in, not to act as if there was a dollar gap. And third, we have to persuade them to assume some of the responsibilities that up till now we've maintained to assist underdeveloped countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia make an economic breakthrough on their own.
Mr. Drummond's question now for Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, a question on American prestige. In light of the fact that the Soviet ambassador was recently expelled from the Congo and that Mr. Khrushchev has this week canceled his trip to Cuba for fear of stirring resentment throughout all Latin America, I would like to ask you to spell out somewhat more fully how you think we should measure American prestige to determine whether it is rising or whether it is falling.
Well, I think there are many tests, Mr. Drummond, of prestige. And the significance of prestige, really, is because we're so identified with the cause of freedom. Therefore, if we're on the mount, if we're rising, if our influence is spreading, if our prestige is spreading, then those who stand now on the razor edge of decision between us or between the communist system, wondering whether they should use the system of freedom to develop their countries or the system of communism, they'll be persuaded to follow our example. There have been several indications that our prestige is not as high as it once was. Mr. George Allen, the head of our information service, said that a result of our being second in space in the Sputnik in 1957, and I quote him, I believe, I paraphrase him accurately, he said that many of these countries equate space developments with scientific productivity and scientific advancement. And therefore, he said, many of these countries now feel that the Soviet Union, which was once so backward, is now on a par with the United States. Secondly, the economic growth of the Soviet Union is greater than ours. Mr. Dulles has suggested it's from 2 to 3 times as great as ours. This has a great effect on the underdeveloped world, which faces problems of low income and high population density and inadequate resources. 3, a Gallup poll taken in February asked people in 10 countries which country they thought would be first in 1970, both scientifically and militarily. And a majority in every country except Greece felt that it would be the Soviet Union by 1970. 4, in the votes at the UN, particularly the vote dealing with Red China last Saturday, we received the support on the position that we had taken of only 2 African countries. One, Liberia, which has been tied to us for more than a century, and the other, Union of South Africa, which is not a popular country in Africa. Every other African country either abstained or voted against us. More countries voted against us in Asia on this issue than voted with us. On the neutralist resolution, which we were so much opposed to, the same thing happened. The candidate who was a candidate for the president of Brazil took a trip to Cuba to call on Mr. Castro during the election in order to get the benefit of the Castro supporters within Brazil. There are many indications. Guinea and Ghana, 2 independent countries within the last 3 years. Guinea in 57, Ghana within the last 18 months, both now are supporting the Soviet foreign policy at the UN. Mr. Herter said so himself. Laos is moving in that direction. So I would say our prestige is not so high. No longer do we give the image of being on the rise. No longer do we give an image of vitality.
Mr. Vice President.
I would say, first of all, that Senator Kennedy's statement that he just made is not going to help our Gallup polls abroad, and it isn't going to help our prestige either. Let's look at the other side of the coin. Let's look at the vote in the Congo. The vote was 70-0 against the Soviet Union. Let's look at the situation with regard to economic growth as it really is. We find that the Soviet Union is a very primitive economy. Its growth rate is not what counts. It's whether it is catching up with us, and it is not catching up with us. We're well ahead, and we can stay ahead, provided we have confidence in America and don't run her down in order to build her up. We could look also at other items which Senator Kennedy has named, but I will only conclude by saying this. In this whole matter of prestige, in the final analysis, it's whether you stand for what's right. And getting back to this matter that we discussed at the outset, the matter of Quemoy and Matsu, I can think of nothing that will be a greater blow to the prestige of the United States among the free nations in Asia than for us to take Senator Kennedy's advice that will go against what a majority of the members of the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, said in 1955, and to say in advance, we will surrender an area to the communists. In other words, if the United States is going to maintain its strength and its prestige, we must not only be strong militarily and economically, we must be firm diplomatically. Certainly, we have been speaking, I know, of whether we should have retreat or defeat. Let's remember that the way to win is not to retreat and not to surrender.
Thank you, gentlemen. As we mentioned at the opening of this program, the candidates agreed that the clock alone would determine who had the last word. The two candidates wish to thank the networks for the opportunity to appear for this discussion. I would repeat the ground rules likewise agreed upon by representatives of the two candidates and the radio and television networks. The entire hour was devoted to answering questions from the reporters. Each candidate was questioned in turn, and each had the opportunity to comment on the answer of his opponent. The reporters were free to ask any question on any subject. Neither candidate was given any advance information on any question that would be asked. Those were the conditions agreed upon for this third meeting of the candidates tonight. Now, I might add that also agreed upon was the fact that when the hour got down to the last few minutes, if there was not sufficient time left for another question and suitable time for answer and comment, the questioning would end at that point. That is the situation at this moment. And after reviewing the rules for this evening, I might use the remaining few moments of the hour to tell you something about the other arrangements for this debate with the participants a continent apart. I would emphasize first that each candidate was in a studio alone except for 3 photographers and 3 reporters of the press and the television technicians. Those studios identical in every detail of lighting, background, physical equipment, even to the paint used in decorating. We newsmen in a third studio have also experienced a somewhat similar isolation. Now, I would remind you the 4th in the series of these historic joint appearances scheduled for Friday, October 21st. At that time, the candidates will again share the same platform to discuss foreign policy. This is Bill Shadell. Good night.
An ideology known as Stalinism has begun to grow in the West, not with any notable importance in politics, but with enough popularity among the youth that it's important to address the reality of Stalinism. The regime of Joseph Stalin has been treated as untouchable by contemporary communist circles, as any arguments against them have almost unanimously been decried as Western propaganda attempting to remove intellectual responsibility from the individuals who uphold this ideology and its historical implementation. Throughout this video, I will thoroughly break down every point at which Stalin and his regime failed at their most basic duties, utilizing primary and second-hand sourcing to demonstrate the abysmal and bloody failure of Stalinism in its home country of the USSR. Any critique of Joseph Stalin and the ideology of Stalinism should likely begin with a discussion on the topic of collectivization. Collectivization was one of the primary economic policies pursued by Joseph Stalin, which implemented full public ownership over the agricultural sector, removing the kulaks, or wealthy peasants, from control over agriculture. Stalinists frequently argue that without collectivization, the economy would have undergone too little economic development and millions would have starved. This is incorrect. Without the horrible failure known as collectivization, contrary to the opines of the Stalinist apologizers, there would have been consistently greater yields and farmland productivity by 1939 than there would have been, and indeed were, under Stalinism. During the Stalinist era, there was an objective drop in agricultural efficiency as production efficiency, with labor taken into account, and with the amount of capital involved in agricultural production taken into account, also known as total factor productivity, was consistently worse than it was under the new economic policy, and not better in the slightest than it was under the Tsarist era. In fact, the Stalinist agricultural policy would only rival that of the Tsars by the early 1940s. This is consistent with the disruption of grain production within the USSR, the deportation and murder of the most productive peasants and kulaks within villages, and a decline in the number of livestock due to the disaster of collectivization itself, which resulted in a drop in grain production, which had formerly been used to feed the livestock. The graph on screen shows the extrapolated wedges for manufacturing total factor productivity and agricultural total factor productivity under both the Tsar and Stalin, with Stalin being represented by the straight line and the Tsar being represented by the dotted line. As one can see quite clearly, there's nothing at all impressive about the total factor productivity levels under Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union. The depeasantization of the rural countryside explicitly resulted in urban peasantization, as many fled the collectivized farms to the cities, which also tied in with the drop in economic productivity universally. Throughout the 1930s, agricultural output had fallen below the 1928 level, and there was a consistent deficit in agriculture year over year, which lowered urban and rural living standards collectively, one might say. Is this a revolutionary success in agricultural development? No, this is just pathetic. The wealthiness of the kulaks is a complete invention as well. The supposed wealthy kulaks had an average of 2 cows and a few acres more than their fellow peasants did. Not much more land at all. Strange standards, such as employing workers, was used as criteria for being a kulak. According to the ruling of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation, number 31B989, all kulaks were denied of housing, all property, and voting rights. The initial acceptance by the countryside, which the Bolsheviks had enjoyed under the new economic policy, was completely decimated under the Stalinist government. The hoarding of grain by the kulaks can only be considered a reasonable reaction to the communist regime forcibly confiscating their property. So, was collectivization and dekulakization necessary? No, the state's monopoly over agriculture was just disastrous. Heavy state control over agriculture has always resulted in catastrophe. This disaster was due particularly to the end of the profit incentive, who was to be incentivized to produce under the Stalinist model. The extraction and distribution of resources from productive sectors was mechanically planned with precision by a central planning committee. Security guards, police, inspectors, and accountants rigorously monitored the production processes, and therefore the production incentive was no longer one ran by profit, designated by market mechanisms, but rather by the force of the police. What Stalin had, in effect, introduced was a return to the serfdom of the Russian Empire. Farmers weren't allowed to leave the farm on their own volition, and the state would take the majority of crops produced on farms at very low prices, as any land or livestock which the peasants had initially earned was confiscated by the state entirely as the collectivization raged on. Other non-proletarian forces met worse fates than the kulaks. In 1933, 6,100 innocent individuals from the so-called lumpen proletariat were forcibly evicted from the cities and transported to an island known as Nazino, where they were starved to death, while individuals who attempted to flee were shot and killed by the military until, in the end, only 2,200 people were left to live. The rest had died in the cold, starved, or been cannibalized upon. The Kazakh peoples, on the other hand, had their animals collectivized, bringing an end to their ancient way of nomadic life. It could have been true that the deaths of the Kazakh peoples weren't something which the Stalinist government was foaming at the mouth to achieve, but simply, as many scholars say, a price which the state was willing to pay for total control over the nation's agriculture. That could have been true if it weren't for the large number of Ukrainians in the region which had been deported there, which the Soviet government sought to eradicate. Some may view this as Western propaganda. However, it should be noted that the Ukrainians in Kazakhstan had the second highest mortality rate after the Kazakhs themselves, losing 36% of their population by 1933, as opposed to other ethnic groups, which lost only about 10% of their general populations. Over the course of the entire Kazakh famine, redistribution of damages led to the death of 1.5 million Kazakhs, again demonstrating the worthless and destructive nature of Stalin's reforms in their entirety. As Nicolo Pianchiola in The Collectivization Famine in Kazakhstan 1931 to 1933 states, quote, what was officially described as the expropriation of the property of approximately 700 owners of large animal herds acted as a cover for the indiscriminate pillaging of the entire rural Kazakh population. Moving our discussion away from the economic and towards the political front, it is undeniable that when one speaks of Stalin, one can't go without mentioning the Great Purge. The Great Purge killed hundreds of thousands of citizens of the USSR at the very least, a horror which none deny. The only question regarding the Great Purge pertains to its necessity, its efficient scale, it can be demonstrated without reasonable doubt that Stalin's Great Purge was the product of a substantive deal of paranoia, not material evidence of disloyalties or subversive elements in almost all cases. For example, 98 of the 139 Central Committee members elected to the 17th Party Congress of the Communist Party were executed during the Great Purge, hardly numbers that instill confidence that the Stalinist government was simply purging only corrupt officials. Supposedly, this was necessary, the Soviets said. Of the armed forces, 81 of the 103 generals and admirals within the USSR were executed. At least 700,000 members of the Communist Party were killed. Notably, the primary victims of these killings were original members of the Communist Party, such as Nikolai Bukharin. The official reasoning for the execution of Bukharin provided by the Soviet state was that he had aided in organizing a plot against the USSR's government. Bukharin was executed for this supposed conspiracy, which he was claimed to have admitted to, while those closest to Bukharin, such as his wife, denounced this confession as an absolute forgery. Anna Larina, Bukharin's wife, stated, "But the most amazing thing is that despite everything, the time of shining hopes had not passed for him. He would pay for these hopes with his head. Moreover, one reason for his preposterous confessions in the dock, incomplete but sufficiently egregious confessions, was precisely this. He still hoped that the idea to which he had dedicated his life would triumph." Nonetheless, without anything to confirm this case, the conviction of Bukharin was based solely upon confession, if that. This isn't how real court cases work. Evidence is needed beyond verbal affirmation or even eyewitness to confirm that a crime did or did not in fact occur. Confession without corroboration doesn't matter, and corroborating evidence wasn't present within Bukharin's trial. After Bukharin's execution, Anna Larina, his wife, was sent to a labor camp. Stalin found humor in the deaths of many of the other members of the Communist Party, such as Grigory Zinoviev. Zinoviev's execution was recreated as a play and portrayed to Stalin, who laughed in the theater as Zinoviev's character met his demise while begging for mercy. A frequent talking point among the modern Stalinists attempting to defend the legacy of their dear leader is that the Gulag was far less bloody and held far less prisoners per capita than the United States prison system did throughout the 1930s to 50s. This is a very stupid opinion, as the Gulag was but a single branch of the USSR's entire prison system, and so to compare the entirety of the United States prison system with that of only the USSR's Gulag is just pathetically moronic. But let's entertain this idea. Even so, at their height, the Gulags held 2,500,000 individuals, 100,000 persons more than the entire United States held at the height of their entire prison system's activity in 2008. When the United States held some 2,400,000 individuals at once. These may seem like similar quantities, but when the size of the prison system is compared to the size of the general population, the disparity in active inmates becomes alarming. Most people know that the Gulag was a bloody system far less desirable than that of the United States. However, some members of the far left don't understand this simple truth. The following statement is for them. At the height of the U.S. prison system's number of active inmates, between 2007 to 2010, 17,358 individuals died while in custody. On the other hand, within the Gulag, 61,796 individuals died per year on average. What's supposed to be impressive about failing even more brutally than a modern neoliberal hellhole in prison statistics? I'm not quite sure. Let's not forget about the Katyn massacre, in which the Stalinist government slaughtered 21,857 prisoners of war, and then proceeded to blame Nazi Germany as having executed the prisoners which they themselves killed, a position which cowardly scholars who hope to vindicate the brutal legacy of Stalin, such as Rover Fur, have taken back up, arguing that official Soviet documentation regarding the massacre is forged. Fur doesn't make any real argument as to why this document is forged. He only has the spine to point out oddities in the document, such as a new date being added at a later point. He lays forward no further argument for forgery. He proceeds to then, throughout his work on Katyn, misrepresent documents regarding prisoners of war and internees to attempt to back up his points. These lies should not be surprising from a pro-Soviet propagandist. However, it should be noted that in 1990, the USSR itself admitted to the massacre and apologized. To attempt to refute the USSR's own admission is a futile effort, I'm afraid. Many communists and Russian sympathizers nowadays deny the occurrence of the Holodomor by stating that the intentional mass starvation of the Ukrainian people didn't occur, or, on the other hand, that it did occur and simply was a mistake due to miscalculations in economic distribution. Both of these positions are Equally as uninformed, the Council of People's Commissars and the Central Committee of the Communist Party demanded that requests for seed loans from Ukraine in September of 1932 should be denied, reasoning that apparently the government knew that there should be more than enough agricultural production in the region to ensure food sufficiency. One telegram reads, "First, refuse all requests concerning seed loans. Second, forewarn the Soviet and collective farms that they will not be provided with seeds for winter or spring sowing." They were wrong, of course, as we all know that even the USSR officially reported starvation during this period. An exodus of peasants from Ukraine to Moscow and Belarus was reported in early 1933, and in response, Stalin demanded that the flights of the peasants from the countryside should be prohibited in all instances, stating, "The CCAUCP and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR have received reports on the mass flight of peasants for bread to the central Black Earth Oblast, Volga, Moscow Oblast, Western Oblast, and Belarus. The CCAUCP and the USSR Sovnarkom ordered the Regional Council and the official OGPU representative in the Northern Caucasus to prevent the mass departure of peasants from the Northern Caucasus to the other regions and entry into the region from Ukraine. The CCAUCP and Sovnarkom order the CCCPBU, Ukrainian SSR RNK, Belitsky, and Redens to prevent the mass departure of peasants from Ukraine to other regions and entry to Ukraine from the Northern Caucasus. The CCAUCP and Sovnarkom ordered the official representatives of the OGPU in Moscow Oblast, Central Black Earth Oblast, Western Oblast, Belarus, Lower Volga, and Mid-Volga to arrest peasants fleeing north from Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus, and after the filtration of counter-revolutionary elements, return the remainder to their places of residence. The so-called rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union during the late 1920s and early 1930s remains perhaps one of the most interesting economic developments of the 20th century. Many communists praise the industrialization effort of the USSR as a socialist economic miracle. The facts, however, are far less charitable to Stalin's economy. Far from practical opposition to capitalism or independent economic development, the USSR in fact leveraged foreign corporate capitalism to accelerate its own industrial development by engaging with American companies and utilizing credit arrangements, technology transfers, and managerial know-how. The Soviet state was only then able to modernize its military and heavy industry. Contrary to popular knowledge, the most important aspects of Soviet industrialization were its engagements with American corporations, which brought with them decades of experience in mass production and industrial management. Firms such as General Electric and the Ford Motor Company provided machinery, technical expertise, management practices, and training programs which were foundational to the Soviet Union's industry. On May 31st of 1929, a landmark contract was signed for assistance in building an automobile plant near Nizhny Novgorod. The agreement projected an annual capacity of 70,000 trucks and 30,000 cars. Ford not only supplied vehicles and spare parts, but also technical assistance through personnel exchanges and training programs that introduced American mass production techniques to Soviet industry. Under the leadership of corporate elites such as Solzhenitsyn Braun at the Amtorg Trading Corporation, which was a quasi-private enterprise that functioned as the intermediary between American firms and Soviet industry, the Soviet state was able to secure contracts for the supply of equipment, technical blueprints, and even on-site supervision for factory construction, which was also aided by the American Austin Company. This collaboration jump-started projects in sectors such as automotive production and electrification, while introducing the Soviet Union's modern industrial processes that gave shape to their manufacturing for the next 2 decades. Through the efforts of the Amtorg Trading Corporation, Soviet imports of American industrial and agricultural equipment increased several-fold, enabling the USSR to purchase state-of-the-art machinery that would have otherwise been completely inaccessible to it. Given the restrictions imposed by the U.S. government at the time upon the USSR, direct foreign investment in the country was limited, so instead the Soviets benefited from indirect investment, mainly through long-term credit arrangements. These credit lines, extended by private American firms on favorable terms, were what allowed the USSR to finance the procurement of its industrial equipment. These engagements often involved staggered payments and low interest rates and provided sufficient capital to build the Soviet Union's new factories, its power plants, and infrastructural projects without the need for direct equity investment. When Solzhenitsyn Braun assumed leadership at the Amtorg Trading Corporation in 1927, Soviet goods constituted only 0.3% of American imports, and Soviet purchases were a mere 1.15% of all U.S. exports. However, under Braun's management, by the end of March of 1928, total trade between the United States and the USSR had been increased to approximately 80 million USD, which was worth more than double the previous 6-month period. Within a year, the fiscal year 1929 to 1930 saw Soviet-American trade reach about 128.8 million USD. By March of 1930, Amthorg had facilitated transactions with 1,700 American firms, with over 400 companies involved in ongoing trade, and of note, 104 technical assistance contracts were active in Soviet industries. The most apparent sector of the economy impacted by foreign capitalism was in the revitalization of Soviet transport. Prior to private initiatives aiding the USSR, the Soviet automobile and tractor industries were basically non-existent. Through negotiated contracts with American companies like Ford, however, the USSR was only then able to construct its modern assembly plants, such as the one in Nizhny Novgorod, which would later become known as Russia's Gorky automobile plant. These plants imported American-designed vehicles and received technical drawings, production methodologies, and even personnel exchanges, which allowed Soviet engineers and workers to acquire the skills that they needed for mass production. General Electric, yet another private corporation, not only supplied advanced electrical equipment and motors to the Soviets, but also established technical bureaus in Moscow, which supervised installations and maintenance. The infrastructural improvements essentially given to the Soviets by General Electric and other American corporations ranged from prefabricated steel elements for construction to improved transport networks. In a contract signed on October 9th of 1928, General agreed to supply equipment with a 5-year credit arrangement, allowing purchases up to 26 million USD with a 25% down payment. By June of 1930, even the British government had guaranteed 150 million USD in credits for trade with the USSR over the following 2 years, and British corporations flooded to aid the Soviet economy with Imperial Chemical Industries, supplying fertilizers, Armstrong-Vickers providing tractors, and Associated British Machine Tool makers entering into the trade agreements as well. After the World War was brought to an end, the Soviet Union experienced a rapid rise in birth rates, some might call it a baby boom, as its government prioritized industrialization. Its attempts to retain the appearance of strength in the eyes of the post-war international community led it to reduce eligibility for ration cards that Soviet citizens relied on the year after the war ended, while raising the prices of foodstuffs. In order to project its strength, the USSR exported goods to its partners, which the internal population desperately needed in the face of an immense post-war food shortage as a drought occurred. This drought, in effect, decreased yields for some products, such as potatoes and grain, by 60%. Not that it mattered, as the purchasing power of the average worker was extremely underdeveloped in the post-war period, as wages had remained stagnant since 1940 and weren't keeping up with the government's price hikes for basic goods. A letter to the RSFSR Education Committee by a female principal of Shemin Elementary School states, "I have 4 children as dependents. 3 of them are in school. My husband died at the front. In October, I didn't receive bread cards for the children. What do I do? We have enough vegetables to last us a month. Commercial bread and produce are impossible to get. What do I do? Quit my job as a pedagogue, having 11 years of experience? It would be sad. It's a pity. I worked in the Urals for 6 years without arrest, forging victory, and now I have to die of hunger in my home village." Stalin's policies weren't revolutionary steps towards the end of history. They were unanimously catastrophic missteps. They devastated Russian agriculture, they decimated rural communities, and caused horrific levels of widespread human suffering. These policies destroyed the USSR's productive capacity and inflicted genuinely irreparable social and economic damage to the average citizen. Even the celebrated industrial advances were entirely reliant on foreign capitalist expertise. These facts show conclusively that the supposed triumph of communism